Somebody kept telling me, you need to meet John Duvall. He is in Edmonds. He's doing some incredible things all around the city. And so we met a couple of months ago, had a great time together. One of those conversations where we could have talked for 10 hours quite easily. Just so many things in common. I thought, as soon as I met John, I thought, you've got to come and speak in Bellevue. And you need to come to Edmonds sometime this fall, okay? Please. Like Jeff said, he runs liminal space. That is a great phrase, which I'm sure you'll unpack for us a little bit. He does a variety of things, life coaching, counseling, helping people in transition.
So it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and that is that space of transition. I want to tell you about Sarah, Dan, and Tim. Sarah is 50 years old. About 3 years ago, she sent her last child off to college. And it was supposed to be this new season within her marriage where the two of them would travel together. They would go on adventures together, do missions together. About 6 months after that last child went off to college, her husband found a dream job in another city, and he really wanted it, and he wanted to move. She didn't. So they thought they would do a long-distance kind of marriage where she would visit on the weekends or vice versa. And about 6 months into this experiment, he said he wanted to separate. And about a year after that, the divorce was finalized. So in a town that she knew very well for 20 years, she felt like she was a stranger, that every part of her identity was wrapped up in her marriage and her family, and now all of that was, in many ways, no longer there. Scarlet D on her chest, within her faith community especially. They didn't know what to do with her. So there's all these questions of, what do I do now? How do I build a new life? How do I actually practically pay for a life? Because now no longer does my husband provide for me. All of these questions of now what? Dan, 30 years of a very successful career. And after that, after 30 years of doing something that he's really, really good at, has noticed over the course of the last 2 years that a growing discontent with the work, a growing discontent with his life. Gnawing questions related to, like, do I really want to keep doing this for another 15, 20 years? He's 50 and has, again, a lot of success and a lot of wealth. Has a lifestyle that he and his family have enjoyed, and he's provided well for his family. He was walking into work one day and passed this homeless man that he's probably passed 200-300 times, and never took the opportunity to actually look at his face the way that he did this time. And as he's walking by, in the midst of all the questions that he's asking, feeling the discontent of his life, pissed at some level that he's going back to the office on a Monday, dreading the week ahead, and he sees this guy look him in the face and smile like he is incapable of smiling, and says to himself, there's something he has that I don't, and I have everything. What do I do with the questions that are gnawing at my soul? Because I want that. Tim, bored. And yet, the work that he does is very dynamic. He's a high-rise window washer. He spends every day washing windows, same monotonous activity day after day after day, and feels like on some level, people tell him, wow, you wash windows, and what's that like? You must be, that's quite invigorating. It has some level of appeal to most people, but he is just completely bored with the work that he does and does not know how to build a life that actually could produce some level of joy. So these questions of, I've been doing this for 8 years now, what do I do next? What do I do to get out of this bored story, this cul-de-sac, this monotonous that is really eating at my soul? These questions that all three of these individuals are asking are the questions of transition. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about. They're hallway kind of questions. They're the questions that happen when you get kicked out of a room that was really familiar, where you had a sense of this is familiar. These are the things I orient my life around, and suddenly the plans change. It's the spouse that no longer wants to be married to you anymore. It's the job where you get fired from, or sometimes the change happens slowly, and you realize the room doesn't fit anymore, and so it's I know this isn't working. I know the work I've been doing for years just is not working, and I cannot figure out a way to make it work. So the room doesn't work. I need to go through the hallway, but that's scary. People look at the hallway as something to avoid at all costs, right? There's discomfort here, especially for Christians. There's a sense of, this is not where life is. Life is in the next room, right? Life is in the empty tomb. We want to get there quickly. We want to get through the hallway times in life. My approach and my belief is that the hallways, that's where the real gold is. That's where there's difficult questions, but the questions lead you to the very things that your heart desires the most. And that's why we spend time in the hallways. And if we treat this like a nuisance, we do a disservice to the very thing that I think God has created in this world for us to explore the deeper parts of our heart and our desires. I want to talk about 4 elements of transition. Change, rupture, transition, and then the myths attached to transition. So about 8 years ago now, I was working on a roof, painting, and I was a contractor at the time. And it was the last house of the season. We were going to get this done in a couple of days and then be done with exterior painting and on to all the interior work that was present or in the queue. I was on the roof, and my foot slipped as I was getting on the roof, and I realized we can't be up here. We were just trying to force the job. So I decided to walk across the roof and get off at a different ladder, and that was not a very good choice. It was one of those cedar shake roofs that was mildewy, and as I approached the edge of the roof, one of them broke, and I fell on my bum and slid right off the roof and landed onto concrete. About 10 feet or so. Wasn't a really high fall, but it crushed my ankle. And as I stood up and took that first step forward, I collapsed and almost immediately knew that this story was going to change for good, but not knowing exactly how. It was a huge change for me and my family. I spent the next 2 weeks at Harborview with 3 surgeries, each taking 12 to 14 hours. It's not the kind of break that was, we're just going to fix this, set it, and you can move on. It's the kind of break where they were like, if you don't listen to what we're telling you, you're going to lose your foot. So that got my attention, right? And my wife's. We knew that this was going to change the course of our family's history. I spent the next 4 to 6 months on the couch, and then slowly finding my legs again, going from the couch to the scooter to the crutches to the cane, and finally being able to walk again. But it was a huge change in my life where all the questions that were coming at us were coming. How am I gonna provide for my family? I don't want to do the work that I'm doing. This is not why I moved out to Seattle. I moved out to Seattle to do something more meaningful with my life. Not that painting wasn't a good, meaningful place of work, but it just wasn't what I felt called to. How do I get out of this? How do I build a new life? How's my family going to be provided for? We had a 4-month-old at the time. It was a huge disruption. Change is the external event that disrupts the story. It is the fall. It is the relationship that ends. It is the job that comes to a close. It is retirement. It is these events that happen in life that change the story significantly. And what it does is it ruptures a lot of things. Rupture, that sense of the meaning within the story, the plot that the story had been on, changes. And sometimes that happens really suddenly, and sometimes that erodes slowly over time. And that gnawing question or gnawing questions begin to come at you, and you can feel them in the conversations, in the way you go about a day, the routines of your life. Those routines that hold predictability from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed begin to go under strain. Some of them change suddenly overnight, like with the fall and the injury that I went through, or the divorce, or the getting fired. Whatever the change was, it changes the predictability. We all like some level of routine and predictability in our life. I have a 3-year-old. Every night when I put him to bed, there is an order, right, that I have to take with that process. And it's really super cute for a 3-year-old. But when a 50-year-old goes through the routines and the disruptions and they've been doing, or the routines and the patterns of their life they've been doing for 20, 30 years, that begins to become a place of entrapment. They don't know how to move out of that place of routine. And so a lot of things set them up to feel a certain sense of lifelessness in their life, a lack of engagement with desire, creativity, possibility. So on some level, we're created for routines. There's a level of comfort that we need in our life, but we also need things that hold risk and creativity. So what would be the process? What would be the very thing that an individual could discover more of who they are and what they want with their life? And what would God set up in this world that's full of change, right? On one level, we are never going to get away from that as long as we live on this earth, as long as we are breathing. The one thing we are all guaranteed is we are going to go through change after change after change. And we have this gift that God gave us, the ability to make choices. What's the tool that He's going to put in our life to provide us the opportunity to make those choices, right? And respond differently with the precious life that we have and not take our freedom away to choose? I believe it's transition. A lot of people describe this place as stuck. We describe this space as something that it's just so unpleasant and it's a nuisance at best, and we want to get out of it, right? Right? And what does it mean for us to stay in that space of transition long enough to hear what it is that we truly want? What it is that we believe God's calling us into? For my life, and for the clients that I've worked with, this is a very challenging space to be in, right? And again, that sense of what I want has to be on the other side. It has to be in the next chapter, in the next room, in the next job, in the next relationship. And there's good things about that. But I think it's important, especially for those that are Christ followers, to remember that there is something that happens on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And those are 3 distinct days that need to be honored as you move through a transition. Most people are stuck in that place of Saturday. There's a lot of swirling confusion, a lot of ambiguity, a lot of uncertainty. Get me out of that, right? There's a lot of waiting and not knowing. A lot of people on Saturday cannot reconcile what happened on Friday. They don't understand what happened on Friday. And what we need help with is understanding what happened on Friday and what are the questions on Saturday telling me about what happened on Friday and what I want for Sunday. We have to do that work of Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and that is the work of transition. That image, which is the image of a head of grain in a hand, if you take a head of grain and you put it in your hand and you apply pressure, eventually the kernels are going to come loose. But some people, when they're doing that, I do this with clients all the time. I give them a grain of kernel and I say, I want you to start rubbing that in their hand. And some do it really, really fast, right? And all of the stuff falls onto the ground. And some do it really, really slowly and passively, you could say, right? It's that process of applying pressure to the transition, to the questions that are coming up, to the desires that are present in your life, to the needs that are present. And you have to apply pressure and examine what's happening. Well, not enough. I got to apply more pressure. I got to ask these questions a little bit deeper. I have to go deeper. So there's this rhythm between action and contemplation, applying pressure, doing some of the work with the questions and the things that are being stirred during transition, and seeing what happens, seeing what's coming of that work. That's the work of transition, the balance between action and contemplation and discernment. I love this quote by Viktor Frankl. Do you know who he is? Austrian psychiatrist. He was in the Nazi death camps. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our responses lies our growth and our freedom. So in that space of life transition, there is a space there that we can show up to and honor what's happening in that space and have it impact who we are, who we become, and the choices we make out of that space. That would be a healthy way to go through transition. Unfortunately, this is where also a lot of people get stuck and don't know how to move forward and make choices that actually result in a different story. Right? This is painful to watch. Some of you know this personally, but it's also something you observe in those that you care for and love or who work for you. You know what it's like to see someone make the same mistakes or be in the same story again and again and again. This is the individual that goes from one job to the next, and every 6 months it seems as though there's something familiar about why they are choosing to leave what they were in, right? And you're like, no, like let's figure this out so that you don't keep making that same story again and again. I believe we're not meant to create the same story again and again and again. There's something that's just so inconsistent about that with who the Creator is. So, in order to talk about what it means to move through a transition well, we also have to talk about myths. Myths, as you know, hold some level of truth to them, but they move you forward in the story perhaps quicker than you should. There's meaning attached to the transition, and much of that meaning is designed to get you out of the transition as quickly as possible. It's to put understanding upon the transition so that you can move through it quicker, rather than stay in it and be in the space of transition and glean more from it. I want to talk about 3 of those: blamers, spiritualizers, and distorters. And as I talk about these, think about how these have intersected your story in your life, especially during the times of transition. Blamers. They did this to me, I did this to myself. This is a tough one because how often it's true, right? It's the boss that was just a jerk. It's the spouse that did this, this, and this to you and caused you this pain or this offense. It's the friend that completely missed you. Whatever it is, there are so many experiences as it relates to being human where you can point the finger. And then quite often, for those that know that story, they also know what it means. We all know what it means to point the finger back at us, at ourselves, right? Blamers and self-blamers. This is such a common experience. And the struggle here is just, again, how often it's true. But when you're looking at your life and the transition this way primarily, it's distorted. There's an inequity there. And yes, there's probably plenty of blame to go around, but you're looking at your world through an adversarial lens. And if it's their fault, then I can wrap meaning around what just happened and not have to take as much responsibility. Right? I don't have to look at myself as much as I should, perhaps, because that may actually be key and critical to moving through this season of transition and becoming the person that I'm supposed to become and could become. Spiritualizers. Since man's highest mission on earth is to spiritualize everything, it's his excrement in particular that needs it most. This is the guy that painted all of those clocks that are melting, and I love that. I count it all joy. God is testing me. God is mad at me. This is such a common one when I'm working with people of faith. There was one client that I worked with not too long ago. She's going through a transition in her work, but she's also a single woman. And the pain of singleness attached to her work life, there was one particular individual that she wanted to pursue a relationship with. And one day they were at a race, a 5K, and the woman that he was dating came up with an injury halfway through the race. And she was so grateful that that happened and felt that it was God ordained, that God did that so that she wouldn't have to see her come over the finish line and hug the guy that she wished she was with, and that somehow God orchestrated the pain in her leg so that she wouldn't have to deal with the pain in her heart. So there's such danger in that, right? When we can assign, what's going on in the spiritual realm and what God's up to in certain moments like that, and say, this is God testing me. This is God doing this in my life right now. I had one person in the hospital when I was there for getting those surgeries, who, as we were talking about what happened, they said, "Man, God sure is trying to get your attention." And my experience of that is like, are you telling me that He gave me a hip check while I was on the roof, resulting in the injury? I have a real problem with that, right? Now I know He's going to use that to form me, and I know that He has done a good work, and I would never choose that again. But tell me that that's not the kind of God that I follow, like that I want to serve, right? That cannot be the kind of God that I follow. That's going to use these kinds of experiences to force me to learn exactly what I need to learn. So that kind of myth, though God does use experiences to teach, to invite us to become who we need to become, we have to be careful about how we assign certain experiences to God or certain ones that aren't. Like, why wouldn't God use this delightful breakfast to speak and get each of our attentions in a particular way? He's going to use anything and everything, especially during transition, to do that. And then distorters. I need to get through this quickly. It's over. I feel better, so I must have done something right. This one is one I see quite often, where all of a sudden the pain and the struggle of what transition feels like eases. And it's that sense of, finally, I've reached Sunday. I've reached the other side of this transition. And on some level, there may be truth to that. But what the dominant experience here for distorters is relief. And I promise you that on Sunday, when they saw the empty tomb and they were in that space of what just happened and how is it that this is empty, that relief was not the only experience that day. Right? There had to have been both surprise and relief and shock, and also a sense of joy that's building and anticipation for what comes next, right? And celebration when they meet and see their Savior, and He's alive, right? If relief is the dominant experience, it's over. Be careful. The transition isn't over. There's more there to learn. There's more there to explore. So let me return to Sarah, Dan, and Tim. Sarah, in my work with her, she had a lot of blaming going on. And for good reason, right? A lot to point the finger at her ex-husband. But also exploring, wait a second, there's also another side of this story. How did your story participate in the marriage that was created between the two of you? That's such hard work to do. Part of her issue was she could point the finger, but then could quickly point the finger back at herself. And that was the common point, and then it's their fault, and somehow I participated in it, and it's my fault too. And such inequity there as far as her taking on most of the blame, actually. And what I needed to do is highlight that. So one day I had her, just for 24 hours, or just a day of being awake, I had her carry around a journal. And I said, every single time you experience a thought that is about self-contempt, or some form of contempt, either at someone else or yourself, I want you to write that down. I want you to write down what you were thinking and how that came about. What were the circumstances? Within 2 hours, she had 75 entries. That was so eye-opening for her. So eye-opening. She had never been invited to look at her own contempt that way, and how it was so relevant to this space of transition that she was moving through. How could she possibly discover a new story with that being the primary lens through which she's seeing her world? How could she discover a story that God actually wants for her and wants to write with her if the primary lens through which she sees everything is either their fault but mostly mine? That needed to be disrupted. That needed to be redeemed. So we spent a good portion of time thinking about what does self-care right now in this season of your life need to be and become more of on a regular basis. part of what it means during a transition to move through it with integrity, with as much courage as you can muster, with as much desire that needs to surface as possible, and to stay in it as long as possible, is to think about what kinds of things can you engage that keep your heart in the game, versus the myths that close it down, versus the myths that move you through too quickly. So with Sarah, it was all about self-care. It was all about how can we think through very practically, how can we think through what it means for you to move through this transition, for however long it will be, because it will come to an end, but to do so building a discipline around self-care. So she started to do things, very simple things, regular exercise, dieting in a way that was healthy, or nutrition that was healthy for her body. She discovered that she loved to float. You know what float is? Float is you lay in a saltwater bath and you just float. It's dark, it's soothing. It's a really bizarre experience. It's like the most comfortable mattress you've ever slept on. And some people do fall asleep while they're floating in these tanks. You should experience it. I think there's one here in Bellevue. There's one in Green Lake. It's awesome. But those kinds of activities surfaced for her, and she committed to them. And I held her feet to the fire on that. But what came out of that is a new sense of compassion for herself and a deeper sense of vulnerability regarding what she wants during this season. Because if you're doing those kinds of activity and it's growing out of a place of worth, my heart is good. Even in the midst of challenging circumstances, I'm good. What does God want from me right now? What do I want for myself right now? Those are all questions that invite a deeper level of vulnerability and honesty, and it's harder for her to do through that lens of blame. So that was a big part of the process of disrupting. For Dan, kind of lonely, moving through most days, somewhat cynical, skeptical. But one thing that he noticed is every time he spent time with a good friend, he felt more open, more curious, more invited. But it didn't happen that often. It was like once every 3 or 4 months. Get together with a friend after work, the occasional time on the weekend. I read an article recently in the Boston Globe regarding men that said the number one killer for men is not diabetes or heart disease, it's loneliness. And that so resonated for him. And so what we did is we talked about, so every time you're with these friends, you feel a sense of aliveness, like you're using language that describes you more alive. So what if we mechanized that? What if we said, why don't you do that once a week? What would it mean once a week to get together with a friend or a colleague or someone that you know you respect and want to learn from and explore this space of transition and the questions you're asking more intentionally? Make that a discipline. And he started to do it. And the things that he was learning, the connections that he was making, this is very basic, simple stuff. But how hard it is for us to say, once a week, I'm going to spend time with someone specifically focused on these deeper things. Very simple discipline, but it transformed the things that he engaged during this space and time through community. Tim, bored out of his gourd, I needed him to take action. The guy loved to create. Loved to, in the evening hours, he would tear apart his motorcycle, he would make it better, he would invite people to do that with him. So I said to him, what would it look like for you to do a class where you invited 6 or 8 people together from your church and you bought a really crappy bike? So he bought a bike for $100, and for the next 4 months, they changed this bike into a powerful racing machine. And he did it in his living room. He turned his entire living room into a shop. Where the dining room table was, the bike was on this rig that he created. And they spent hours together talking, building, learning together, teaching different elements of what it means to transform and create a bike. I needed him to take action in this way to, in many ways, increase the pain of the boredom that he's experiencing in the rest of his day. And then put before him a choice. You could leave. You could create a story that's much more dynamic, much more creative. But we have to engage the fear that's present in doing that. But he had to experience, what does it taste like to do something so creative, to do that with others? It's a powerful movement and action on his behalf. In my work, I've explored 7 of these. Action, creating thoughtful forward momentum. Resilience, shaping a persevering perspective. Self-honesty, clearing away self-deception. Faith, connecting to God's larger story. Community, finding strength through relationship. Self-care, prioritizing kindness for a body under strain. And planning, translating vision into a manageable plan. 7 different dimensions that help a person stay open, curious, and able to learn what the transition is supposed to form in their life, whatever that may be, however turbulent the transition may be. What kind of discipline can you form in your life to stay open and curious? We have an assessment that looks at all 7 of these dimensions. You can find it on our website. That will tell you, based on past transitions, how you've maneuvered through all 7 of these dimensions. Invite you to take it. Would love to do a download with you on it. But it's a powerful tool to expose how you've moved historically through past transitions and what might need to be tweaked to keep you open and available in a current or one that's approaching a transition. So, that 1 minute? 1 minute, okay. So I'll move through these slides really quickly. Liminal space. To tell you a little bit about our organization, liminal comes from the Latin word limens, which literally translates threshold. And again, it's that space of transition that's both turbulent and full of opportunity. And it's a blend of these 4 things: coaching, spiritual direction, therapeutic counseling, and career development work. Believing that all 4 of those disciplines can reside in one experience, one offering, rather than going to 4 different individuals to get those experiences and that expertise, combining the best parts of them into one. And I do that through working with individuals and couples, peer groups, which are groups of 6 individuals moving through a transition together, intensives where one person comes into town and we spend about 5 days with that person, where we own them from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to sleep. We do customized retreats and planning. And then we also have a learning center that we just launched this fall, or last fall in Edmonds. And the learning center creates workshops in all 4 of these categories around calling and purpose, career development work, life stage transitions like empty nesting and retirement, and then transition skills like caring for your body, self-care kind of activities. That's what's in the packet of information that you have on liminal space. There's different workshop inserts in there where you can learn about some of the recent and upcoming offerings. On Friday, June 2nd and Saturday, June 3rd, I'll be leading these 3 workshops. These are all about calling and purpose, demystifying what that word calling actually means, and then exploring a person's unique gifts and talents, and then combining those 2 into a conversation around what does it mean to step into purpose and do that with courage for your life in the midst of all of the current constraints. And I love this quote by Frederick Buechner. We are fools if we don't live life as bravely and as beautifully as we can. And to me, that conversation around how to do that takes place in transition. That's where the opportunities are. That's where the gold is. That's where the treasure is. The parable of the man who found a treasure in a field. Those treasures are most accessible, most possible of finding, and most best place in life to explore what to do with that treasure, how to invest it, your life for the sake of a story much, much bigger than your own in the kingdom. That's my presentation to you this morning.